Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. Tonight's topic is on the 5 most common mistakes of estranged and alienated parents. And I realized as I wrote it, there's actually a bonus mistake in there for everybody who wants to know if they've made even more mistakes. One of the things that I want people to know is that once a child of any age starts to turn away from the parent, whether they're a minor or full-grown adult, but they're making it clear that they no longer want the parent in their lives, it's really easy to step into what I call the quicksand, which is basically once those feelings of rejection or shame or fear or anger get triggered, and nothing can trigger in us as parents more than when our children turn away from us. It can trigger such profound feelings that the ways that we respond aren't necessarily in our best interest. So tonight we're going to go over some of those more common ways that parents respond. And some of it we respond to out of fear or anxiety or hurt or anger, but other times we respond just out of kind of the way our parents might have responded from an earlier generation, or ideas about what our children might need from us. So when I use the word mistake, I want you to know that that's something that we all do. I did it when I was going through my estrangement with my adult child. Really, every parent I know goes through one or more, if not all of them. But they're important to label and to understand and to work towards resolution, because your potential for a reconciliation often hinges on whether or not you can either repair the mistakes that you made or get a deeper and better understanding of what it is that's caused your child to turn away from you. So the first mistake that I want to talk about is a feeling that your reconciliation with your child should be based on fairness rather than just straightforward practicality. And what I want you to think about when you're working towards reconciliation is not what's fair. There's a bunch of things about estrangement and alienation which isn't fair. In fact, I would say with all of the families that I work with, it's really unfair. If it were fair, the model would be the same that it would be, say, with a best friend or a spouse or somebody else. You talk about your perspective, they talk about their perspective. You feel hurt, or talk about how the ways that you felt hurt or misunderstood. Your child talks about the way that they feel hurt or misunderstood. You put your heads together, you try to understand where the other one's coming from, you make sense of it, and then you try to move on as a result. But that's not the case once alienation is in place. It's just not that kind of a dynamic. A lot of adult children will say they want a relationship with a parent that's one that's equal, but it's probably not one that's going to feel very equal to you. It's probably going to feel very one way and very unequal. So one of the reasons that parents make so-called mistakes with their adult children when they do this is that most of us have never encountered anything like this in our lives. You know, the rules and guidelines that are required to reconcile are unlike anything that you probably have had to undertake or understand in the rest of your life or apply in the rest of your life. So getting back to the notion of fairness, if it were fair, you'd get to make demands about how much time you could spend with your children or grandchildren. You could ask for more. If it were fair, you could demand more empathy and forgiveness for whatever mistakes you did make with your child growing up or have during this period of time of alienation or estrangement. You could demand more commitment. We actually don't get to do that during this period where you're working on healing the distance between you and your adult child. If it were fair, you would get credit for all the money you spent on your child and for all the time you spent, or being the more dedicated parent than maybe the other parent was in the case of a divorce. It's not infrequent that the much more dedicated parent is being kicked to the curb, and the other parent who wasn't that involved in the parenting, who's often the one who's doing the alienating, is now getting the credit for how the child turned out. They're the ones going on family vacations. They're the ones spending time with the grandchildren. If it were fair, that wouldn't happen. If it were fair, you'd get credit for being as good of a parent as your own, or even a better parent than yours, or giving your child opportunities and experiences as a child or young adult that nobody ever gave you. If it were fair, your child would think about that and give you credit for that and would say that, wow, I know that nobody ever gave you the kind of opportunities that you've given me or spent money on me, or schools or therapy or learning specialists or tutors or whatever. If it were fair, you get credit for that. Your child would think, well, yeah, I'm angry or hurt by my parent for X, Y, or Z, but they really invested heavily in my happiness and well-being, so they should get credit for that. But you're not going to get credit for it. If it were fair, your child would understand that when you said you did the best that you could, you really mean you did the best that you could, and that no parent is able to do any better than what they know at the time that they're raising their children, what the parenting pedagogies were at the time they were raising their children, who they were married to, and how that person might have made parenting much more challenging, what their financial challenges were at the time, what their own childhood traumas were that may have made it harder for them to know how to be a good parent. And finally, the way that the child themselves may have made parenting much more difficult, that our children can have their own challenges when they're young and when they're grown that make parenting much more challenging. They can have learning disabilities, anxiety, depression, ADD, autism spectrum, a whole host of issues, what we call child-to-parent effects, which make parenting much more difficult. In addition, once they're grown, they can marry people, what I call the cult of one, somebody who says to your adult child, choose them or me, you can't have both. And so that is, ends up pulling the child away from the parent. If it were fair, you'd be able to speak to those issues and talk about, in fact, how unfair that is. So what I want you to do is give it up. It's not fair. You have to accept that it's not fair, and it's never going to be fair. That ship has sailed. The era where parents could expect a lot more from their children has now gone. We are now in the era of, children feeling like they don't owe the parent anything. And so if there's going to be a relationship with the parent and the adult child, it's going to be because the adult child wants one, not because they feel obligated to have one or feel like the parent is deserving of that, as unfair as that is. So one of the reasons that you want to have this orientation is if you're too preoccupied with the fairness, you're just going to be mad all the time. You're just going to feel like they're being mean to you, and you feel very victimized by them. And that's not the right condition to try to work towards a reconciliation. It's going to affect how you communicate. It's going to make you more demanding and more resentful than you should be. It's going to make you feel like you should talk about all the ways that you feel hurt or rejected or victimized by your child. If it were fair, you'd be able to talk about it, but guess what? It's not fair. So you can't talk about it. In fact, I'll talk shortly about mistake number 2, about why talking about the ways that you feel hurt or rejected or scared or angry also is a mistake, and why that's also unfair. So really, the model that you really should have is one that you would have more when your children were young. And by that, I mean like the age of 2 or 3. And I don't mean that in any disrespectful way to the adult child. I mean that you shouldn't think that it's going to be one of equals where you get to make demands and talk about your feelings of what your needs and requirements are. When I'm doing family therapy, reconciliation therapy with a parent and an estranged or alienated adult child, I'll often warn the parent before therapy that this isn't like marriage therapy. It isn't like you're going to have an equal say over the terms of the relationship going forward, or you'll have an equal say over how you've been affected. No, it's much more like divorce, like where there's been a divorce and the person who left is considering, well, maybe I'll come back into the marriage, but first I need to hear that you're willing to accept my rules of engagement. That's more what it's like. So even though a lot of these children say they want a marriage of that's equal, they don't really want a marriage, not a marriage that's equal, a relationship with a parent of one that's equal. That's not actually really what they want. They want a relationship where you're attentive and empathic to their needs, and you're in a position of repair, and your needs basically, at least in early reconciliation aren't going to be very much on the table. If you're working towards reconciliation, it means that you're going to have to be much more accepting of the reality that it's a one-way street. It's also going to require more patience from you because nothing is more infuriating, humiliating, and devastating than the rejection of an adult child. It also requires patience because it's going to take time. Sadly, it may take years. But another thing that can be helpful to you is to really work not only for your love for your child, because I think that will allow you to not be so mad at them and to assume that they have their reasons for cutting off contact with you, even if you hate those reasons and even if you think those were completely coached by the alienating parent or somebody else or their therapist or their person that they're married to. It's still useful to think about, well, why they doing this? They must have the reasons for doing this. And again, you don't have to agree with it. You don't have to think that they're right, but you do have to understand it. Finally, and I'm still on mistake number one, so you can see why this lecture is going to last for 75 minutes. You have to have an unconditional love for yourself. And this perhaps is the most important of all the advice that I give to parents who are going through this, because it's very hard for parents, moms in particular, to hold on to their value of themselves as a parent when the child turns against them, because nothing makes us feel more unloved, maybe even more unlovable than when our child rejects us and basically acts like all of our years of love and dedication don't mean anything. Nothing makes us feel more like we were terrible parents, let alone people, than when a child does that, even though rationally we might know for a fact that that's not the case. So you have to own your own narrative of who you are as a parent and a person, and you can't cede that to your child. That is your birthright. I don't care how precious, lovely, whatever, smart, talented your kid is. They don't get to say what kind of a parent or person you were. Do not cede that power and that authority to them. So I have a few techniques that I think are helpful to parents in this regard. One is from my first book on estrangement called When Parents Hurt, Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along. And it's called My Value as a Parent. And in this exercise, you basically just write out 10 things of what made you or makes you a good parent. So it could be things like, I gave my child opportunities nobody ever gave me. I stayed in a difficult marriage because I didn't want to put my kid through a divorce. Or I left an abusive marriage because I didn't want to expose my child to the other parent's abuse. Or I read a lot of parenting books. Or I got my child into therapy. Or I went into my own therapy, or I got my child tutors, or I paid for expensive education, or I paid for any education at all. Whatever it is, write it down, keep it on a 3x5 card. And whenever you get confused about your value as a parent, pull it out and look at it. Now, doesn't mean you didn't make mistakes. I made mistakes. You made mistakes. You know, your kids' parents they're going to make mistakes with their kids. So this idea that, if you make mistakes with your kid, you don't deserve a relationship with them is of course ridiculous, but it's very popular in our culture. So don't believe the hype, but you have to hold on to that value yourself if your child isn't going to give it to you. And while you're going through an estrangement or an alienation, they're not going to give it to you. So stop going to that dry well rather, to get water. You have to get that from your friends or your religious institution or other people who know you and care about you in order to get a much healthier feedback about who you are and who you were. So part and parcel of all of that is being in self-dialogue with who you are as a person and as a parent. So yes, I make a big deal out of making amends to adult children because I think it's one of the best ways to get on the same page with them, show them that you're willing to accept their terms, their rules of engagement, take responsibility. It's also good for your self-esteem as well and your own self-repair to acknowledge your mistakes and face them and not try to hide them from yourself or your child. But you also it's useful to remind yourself that whatever mistakes you made, you had good reasons for those mistakes, and you didn't do them because you were mean or bad or selfish. You did them for some of the reasons that I mentioned before. And if I didn't mention the ones that were true for you, then you should write those down as well. So another useful thing is the ability to compartmentalize your feelings about your child so it doesn't ruin your life. Estrangement and alienation have the power to ruin a parent's life. Your kid does not deserve to ruin your life. Again, I don't care how adorable they are or were or how much you love them or whatever. They don't get to ruin your life. Do not let them do that. So there's a bunch of different ways to do that. One is to write out that exercise. The other is to get feedback from people who know you and love you. The third is the ability to compartmentalize them so you're not thinking about them. It's so easy for parents, moms in particular, to ruminate, which means to turn something over and over and over again in your mind. And a useful way to think about that is the notion that anxiety is living in the future, depression is living in the past, and resilience comes from living in the present, resilience and joy. Now, the reason that I think that's such an important frame is that if you can catch yourself how you're thinking about your estrangement or how you're thinking about yourself, you're probably thinking either in the past or the future. If you're thinking in the past, you're regretting, you're shaming yourself, you're feeling sorrowful, guilty. If you're thinking in the future, you're catastrophizing, you're future tripping, you're worried about whether you're ever going to talk to your grandchildren or children again or see them. And you have no control over that in terms of the future. So far better to work on, whether it's meditation or prayer, some kind of present-centered activity where you turn toward your feeling rather than away from the feeling, where you allow the feeling to come into your awareness rather than to feel like, no, I can't face that feeling. It's too painful. It's too awful. Again, that's why amends letters work. You kind of go like, all right, let's get it all out on paper. Yes, I could see why you felt neglected, hurt, whatever, by me. Here it is. It's all written out. If you write it out, then you're in a position to be able to kind of go, well, there it is, and face it. It's what we talk about as exposure therapy, in cognitive behavior therapy. The idea that if you continue to expose yourself to that of which you're the most afraid of, the thought or the feeling or the belief starts to lose its hold. It's kind of like if you go see a scary movie, right? First time you see it, you're scared if it's doing its job, right? Oh my God, this is where the guy comes in with an axe, starts cutting up people. That's horrifying. Watch that movie 10 times. By 10th time, you're going to be like yawning, pouring yourself, another drink or looking at your email or doing something like that, because your brain has already figured out that the thing that you're the most afraid of isn't going to happen. Well, so the same is true with our beliefs about ourselves and the future and the past. The more that we can just kind of expose ourselves to those feelings and accept them, radical acceptance, as we call it, the better off you're going to be. The more that you try to fight it, white knuckle it, go, no, I was a great parent, I don't deserve this, blah, 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 you're just going to feel worse and worse and worse. So it's critically important, if you get nothing else from today's lecture, the things that I've talked about in terms of the mistakes, self-care, self-compassion, owning your own narrative about who you are as a parent, as a person, not giving that to your kid, that will get you pretty far down the road in terms of feeling better. Okay, but there's more mistakes to go. Aren't you lucky? Mistake number 2 is huge and it's not subtle. And that is trying to motivate your child through guilt or not being mindful about the ways that you communicate with your child that might make them feel guilty. So the reality is today that guilt is really your biggest enemy. It used to be in our society, and it still is true in many other societies, that guilt was considered a reasonable thing to induce in one's children. It was part of giving them a moral framework. This is right, this is wrong. There was a certain degree of clarity about that, and parents weren't so freaking worried about, the coercive effects of their authority. So they felt free to, make their children feel guilty when they behaved badly. And similarly, when they became adults, they felt like they had the power and reasonableness to say, no, that's crappy behavior. Why are you doing that? Don't act like that. That makes you a bad person. That's bad behavior. That ship has sailed. So you can no longer do that. Why? Because you're going to get labeled toxic, narcissistic, borderline, boundary crossing, gaslighting, whatever. So you're not supposed to make your child feel guilty, because we now live in a culture where the only thing that keeps a child in contact with a parent is whether or not that relationship makes them feel good. If it makes them feel good, then they're much more likely to stay in contact with the parent. If the relationship makes them feel bad, then they're much more likely to label the parent and the relationship as problematic. And then you're going to hear that they need to cut off contact with you to work on themselves, and you should be working on themselves, and they need to protect themselves and their children from you because they're working on prioritizing their mental health. So there's a very strong feeling in our culture that if the relationship in any way makes you feel bad or bad about yourself, then not only can you cut off that person, but you should cut off that person, because cutting off that person is a form of separation and individuation and autonomy. These are kind of the watchwords of our culture that really prizes these qualities in ways that's really driving families apart. So guilt is your enemy. It is not your friend. Now, there are still cultures where guilt is a reasonable thing to do. In Japanese child rearing, for example, their Japanese parents very early on inculcate their children, but not in an abusive way, but they just sensitize their children to others' feelings. And surveys of Japanese children versus American children show that Japanese children from a very young age are much more empathic towards other children and have a much better understanding of what other children are feeling than Americans. So what we have wanted from, part of this is our fault as parents, that the way the parenting has changed is that, we're prior generations of parents. If you look at parenting surveys, say in the 1920s, what we wanted from our children was for them to be kind of conforming, church-going members of society. Over time, that's changed. And since the 1960s, what we've wanted is for them to be individuals and autonomous and self-possessed and possessing of social capital and being assertive, knowing what they want, being creative. And at the same time that in the early 1900s and before, there was the notion that stress and difficulties in childhood and in life would make children stronger, it'd build character, strong backbone, put hair on their chest. That all gave way to much more of what some call a form of hothouse parenting, a belief that children are vulnerable and can easily be damaged, and that if parents aren't enormously careful and psychological and intensive in their parenting, then somehow those children aren't going to thrive and they're not going to make it into a healthy, psychologically well-adjusted adulthood. Now, there's plenty of examples in other cultures where parents don't parent that way and their children seem to do just fine. So this model that we've been using for the past half century or so isn't necessarily founded on anything particularly scientific, but it's a very powerful form of parenting ideology and pedagogy that isn't going anywhere and is still very popular. And that's why so many adult children say, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that and you should have done this or that. So I don't owe you a relationship. So I'm cutting off contact with you. So, what does this have to do with guilt? Well, guilt's just going to shut your child down. It's just going to turn your child away from you. And it's just going to cause them to tell you, label you as a narcissist or a borderline, because that's a good way to not feel guilty. If my parents are narcissist or borderline, I don't have any reason to feel guilty for how how I'm responding to them or my lack of availability, because really it's their fault that they have the feelings that they do. It's their narcissism or their gaslighting behavior, etc. So a lot of the times when the adult child says that, they're saying that in the spirit of lessening their feelings of guilt. Okay, well, what are some other ways that you can make your child feel guilty in a problematic way? Well, one is just by telling them how unhappy you are with the estrangement. Now, it seems like, again, getting back to mistake number one, in a fair world, you'd be able to say that, at least you'd be able to say, you're kind of breaking my heart over here, not having any contact with you or my grandchildren. But you don't get to say that because you're not supposed to make your child feel guilty. So if you talk about how heartbroken or upset or sad or, God forbid, angry about what your child is doing, then it's just going to backfire on you and cause them to pull away. Another thing that parents have tragically learned through the pandemic, or if they got a cancer diagnosis, or they lost a spouse, or their spouse has a cancer diagnosis, or some other fateful disease, is that telling the child that may still not bring them around. And in fact, it may cause the child to say, oh, you're just making me feel guilty. You're just trying to make me come around and manipulate me through guilt. So if a child is working on feeling separate from you and for whatever reason has that belief, then making them feel guilty, getting mad at them, understandably, frankly, for not checking in with you, for not caring, or if a revered grandparent is also dying or has died, not coming to the funeral or not giving the parent any kind of condolence. If the parent pushes back and complains about that, then it's just going to make things worse. Now, sometimes parents will say, well, you're just enabling these kids, and we have a right to push back against these kids when they behave in this way, and you're just going to strengthen their voice that their entitledness. And the truth is that you're not going to be able to persuade your child by doing something different. As somebody who writes and speaks in this area, I think I have a much better chance of changing the narrative out there than you do with your own child, because your child has drunk the Kool-Aid of Western individualism. They've drunk the Kool-Aid of feeling like it's all about them and their feelings. And I know I'm being harsh here, but if you work with enough sobbing parents every day, you start to feel a little more harshly towards the kids that are doing this to them. That from the parent's perspective, they've been good, loving parents. And when the child does this, for the parent to be able to say that the child owes them something, or that the parent is ill or their family member is ill, and it'd be nice if the kid showed some interest or care or concern, that shouldn't be labeled as narcissism or manipulation or self-centeredness or that kind of thing. But it may well. So you have to be very judicious and cautious about using that. Again, mistake number one, is it fair? No. But staying with mistake number one, it's all about strategy, not about fairness. Fairness is going to get you every time. The more you're obsessed with it being fair, the more upset you're going to be and the less strategic you're going to be. Okay, well, there's plenty of things that can make your child feel guilty. But the last I'll mention is criticizing them or their spouse or their therapist in any way. That is also forbidden because particularly with criticizing your daughter-in-law or son-in-law, that's just going to cause your child to turn away from you, to be mad at you, to feel protective of that spouse. Not only that, but a lot of them are going to tell their spouse that that's what you did. And then you're going to be completely sunk, because then the spouse is going to be mad at you too. And they're going to say to your child, well, you have to choose them or me. You can't have both. So that also just starts the foot in the quicksand. So guilt is incredibly important to understand and to get your hands around, because guilt is the thing that your child is going to use against you and is going to turn away from you. Again, remember, anything that makes your child feel bad is going to lengthen the period of time where there's conflict and distance with you. So really all of my strategies are predicated on that principle, that your task is to engage with your child in a way that doesn't raise their defensiveness, doesn't make them feel criticized, guilty, anxious, etc. Is it fair? No, but remember mistake number one. Okay, moving on after a sip of water. Mistake number three has to do with the way that you make amends to your child. Now, if you follow my work at all, you know that I make a big deal about the importance of writing an amends letter. And that's because in my research and in my clinical practice, I found that helping parents write a really good, solid letter of amends is really one of the most important active things that they can do to move the relationship towards reconciliation. Now, that said, there's really nothing I can say that's going to work every time for every child. Even if I write the most perfectly crafted amends letter, your kid may still not open the door. Why? They may be too influenced by the person that they're married to. They may be too brainwashed or alienated by your ex. Their mental illness may make them unable to see you with any clarity. They may need to blame you for how their life turned out and feel and have a narrative that it's not their fault, their life turned out poorly, it's your fault. Finally, they may need to maintain the estrangement because it's the only way they know how to feel separate from you. That one of the downsides of all the careful, conscientious, involved parenting that we've been doing over the past half century or so, particularly the last 3 or 4 decades, is that sometimes our kids get too much of us and they don't know any other way to feel separate from us than to cut off contact with us. You know, I've heard more than one adult daughter say, I just need to cut off contact with my parent just so I can get her voice out of my head and hear my own voice. It's what I call lose your parent, find yourself. Or another way to think about it is sometimes the adult child has to forget about the parent in order to find them again. And what do I mean by that? Well, for some adult children, the parent just looms too large in their mind. So sometimes when they're diagnosing the parent, blaming them, shaming them, et cetera, it's really a way to shrink the influence that the parent has over their psychic life. But the parent just has too much, they're just too alive inside of them. So sometimes when adult children are going no contact or out of contact or rejecting the parent, it's partly really in the service of just feeling separate from that parent. And again, sometimes it's perfectly loving, well-meaning, highly conscientious parents. Sometimes it's parents who were, a little too anxious and the kid doesn't know any other way to separate themselves from that parent's anxiety other than to be completely removed from them. So in terms of writing an amends, one of my recommendations is always to start from speaking to the kernel of truth in the child's complaints. Now, maybe there were really serious mistakes and you can just write those easily. We've all made them, frankly. But either way, your amends have to be made in a very non-defensive, vigorous way where you don't try to qualify it. Now, what do I mean by qualify it? I mean, saying things like, well, I did the best that I could. That's for your self-dialogue. Remember before I was talking about self-dialogue versus the dialogue you have with your child? Your self-dialogue is, I did the best I could. Or it's not my fault your dad was never there. Or it was all your mom's fault that I left or that you have been brainwashed against me. Or you were a difficult child. Or your memory of me or the past is all wrong. It's fine to say to yourself or to your friends or whomever, but that's not what you say to your child. With your child, and again, this goes to what I was saying earlier about the importance of trying to lower their defenses, is really just to seek to understand. And by that, I mean to be a co-investigator of their complaints. Now, it's particularly hard if your kid has been alienated against you because half the crap they're going to be saying about you, if not all of it, isn't even true. Or, even if it has a kernel of truth, has been completely blown up or inflamed by your ex, you still have to find some way to speak to it. Why? Because they believe what they believe. It never works ever to say, well, I think you're a victim of parental alienation. What child has ever been persuaded by that line? It's ridiculous. I mean, it's not so ridiculous that I don't understand how a parent could go there, because when a kid is alienated or estranged, we're all desperate to do whatever we can to move it towards resolution. But if your child has been brainwashed against you, they believe the brainwash. So that's what they're believing. So you can't just say it's not true, or that's what your dad said about me, but that's not what I did, or that's what your mom, put that idea, crazy idea into your head. You're far better off if finding a kernel of truth in it, if you can find one. If not, saying something like, well, I don't recall it that way, but I'm interested in the fact that that those are your memories. So would you be open to going forward if I continue to act like that, or if I do it, you'll let me know, or if could we go into therapy and work on it or try to address it together? Now, this is also a good technique if your child is diagnosing you. So many parents are getting diagnosed as narcissists and borderlines by their adult child. So let's say your kid goes, well, I've been in therapy and the therapist said that you're a narcissist, and I got on a website and 10 things that narcissistic mothers do, and you have all 10, and you just want to go, yeah, well, great. Thanks. Thank you, internet, for more propaganda. But you shouldn't say that. You have to meet them where they are. So you want to, as quickly as possible, get off the am I or am I not a narcissist trap. You could say something like, well, I haven't really thought of myself as a narcissist, and I have been in therapy for it and haven't had that diagnosis, but I guess it's possible that I am. I don't know. Is there something that you'd like me to read? And they may have you read some book about narcissism. If they do, try to find like one thing that you can relate to. You could say, yeah, I did think that one part, I guess that did kind of speak. I could identify myself in that. You're already, just in saying that, you're saying, basically, if your kid is healthy enough to have their mind change, and not all of them are, but if they are, you're now establishing a way to begin to work on things, to kind of say something like, well, yeah, I guess I could see that. Going forward, will you let me know other kinds of behaviors? Or if I do that in the future, or you have other memories that speak to this. And if they raise the other memories, your goal is not to prove them wrong, because you cannot prove them wrong. That's another mistake that I don't even have on my list here. So listen for it in future webinars. So you can't prove them wrong. You just want to find out why they believe what they believe. Now, some of these adult children don't tell the parent why they're not in contact. They just go no contact. They either write them a no contact letter, or they say, don't contact me, or they just disappear. Now, in those situations, it's maddening for parents, and parents feel like, well, how am I supposed to write an amends letter if I don't even know what I did, and I can't even think of anything egregious enough to justify their cutting off contact with me? Well, in those situations, you write what I call the flush them out of the bushes letter. Now, the flush them out of the bushes letter goes like this: Dear son or daughter, I'm writing to see if there's a way to heal the distance between us. I know that you wouldn't have cut off contact unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do, even if you as the parent don't think it was the healthiest thing for them to do. It's clear that I have significant blind spots, that I don't have a better understanding of why you do need to do this. Given that, I'm wondering if you feel comfortable writing me or telling me more about what you think or feel, so I can have a better understanding and try to work towards healing some of the distance that you're responding to in terms of my behavior. I promise to read or listen purely from the perspective of learning, and not in any way to defend myself. Now, those letters often work. They don't always work, for the same reason I said before that nothing always works, but they often do work. And they work because the parent, just in saying, I know you wouldn't do this unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do, removes it from kind of the space of the parent not feeling victimized, but the child knows that they're doing something hurtful. So if the parent is able to say, you wouldn't do it unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do, it puts the parent in alliance with the child's aspirations for a healthier relationship. And that's the moral framework of today's youth. The idea of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, that ship has sailed, folks. That's been replaced by actions which promote my growth, my happiness, and my mental health. If a relationship promotes those, then I'm interested. If it doesn't promote those in any way, then I'm not interested. And there's incredible social support out there for not being interested in continuing to have a relationship with anybody, parents included, who don't meet that criteria. So when you can speak in that language in your amends letter, you are showing your child that you're willing to be on their terms, that you're willing to take responsibility, you're willing to play ball in the way that they're constructing reality. And you do that by speaking to the kernel of truth. Now, maybe you know the bushel of truth, maybe you don't know any of the truth, but often there is a kernel of truth in our children's complaints about this. So that's critically important. Now, the reason I'm talking about mistake number 3 as being qualifying your amends with too much defensiveness or explanation is because you're going to ruin an otherwise good effort in trying to make amends with your adult child. If you say things like, I was going through a hard time, I did a lot better job than my parents did with me, or you're making it a lot worse than it really was, or what about last year when you told me I was the best dad or the best mom ever, or what about all the wonderful times we had, or what about all the ways that I sacrificed for you, or don't you have any good memories of me or our relationship or whatever. They're just going to shut you down. They're just going to think that you're not a credible person to deal with, and they're just going to go further and further away from you. So again, this goes back to the notion of self-dialogue versus the dialogue you have with your child. You tell yourself, I did the best I could. You tell yourself it's not my fault because the other parent wasn't a good partner. You tell yourself, yeah, well, you were a difficult kid to raise if they were. You tell yourself, well, your memory of me is all wrong. I was a much better parent than you're recalling or even that you were saying a while ago. So you're going to have to soothe yourself. Your kid isn't going to do it. And they're not going to tell you were a good parent, or they're not going to be even in touch necessarily with all the memories of all the good things that you did and all the videos you have of them smiling and laughing and all the things that break your heart to look at now. Again, mistake number 1, it's not fair. If it were fair, you'd get empathy, you get understanding, you get dedication. Your child would be willing to reassure you. But they're just not going to do it. So what you say to your child is different from what you say to yourself. What you say to yourself is to soothe yourself in the same way that if you were a loving parent would to yourself as a child. You're tender, you're forgiving, you're empathic to yourself. If you did make big mistakes, you have compassion to yourself for why you made those mistakes. You don't frame them in a way of like, oh, you should have known that, or you were too harsh, or no wonder your kid isn't talking to you, or of course they rejected you. Everybody rejects you. No, you think you talk to yourself in the way that you would if you were being, a very kind and loving parent to your own inner child. So one of the ways to think about this is to think about it from the perspective of separate realities. The separate realities is the idea that you could objectively been a great parent, or anybody who watched you growing up could have felt and observed you to be and evaluated to you have been a great parent. But your child may have viewed you differently. They might have needed something more from you. And I call it the separate realities because in every family, if you have a family member of of 5 people, there's probably going to be 5 different realities of what the family was like, what the parents were like, what childhood was like. I mean, I have 2 brothers. We have very different memories of my parents, who they were, kind of based on our birth order and our temperaments and our personalities and what we evoked in our parents, et cetera. So you don't want to get too much into the rightness or the wrongness of it. If your child says, you were X, Y, or Z to me, and I needed you to be different, just accept that they might have needed something different from you than you were, able to give or able to see. But don't get into the right or wrongness of it. Don't try to respond from your perspective. Try to respond from their perspective, meaning that you come say something like, yeah, I get it. You really felt that I wasn't as involved with you as you wished I'd been. Now, you may have been the most involved parent in the world, objectively, but your kid's saying, yeah, you weren't as involved as I needed you to be. You can just say, yeah, you felt that way. Not you felt that way and you're ridiculous, or you felt that way and good luck finding a more involved parent. No, you felt like that, and that was hurtful to you, and I'm really sorry and sad to hear that. It's clear that I have blind spots, that I didn't know that that's what you were going through or felt that way at the time. I can see now how it might have felt like that. So again, look, these kids can say really hurtful, stupid, critical, contemptuous, arrogant, self-righteous things. And frankly, I'm appalled by the way a lot of these kids talk to their parents. And I feel very protective of the parents in my practice and all of the other ones that are going through this that I've never met and never will. But we have to think about it from the perspective of, if our goal is reconciliation, then you have to get an understanding of what was their motivation and what is their motivation for continuing it. As mean and harsh and cruel as it feels, I don't think most of them do it out of some sense of sadism. I mean, maybe a couple are, but in general, I think they're doing it because they're trying to master something. They're either trying to survive with their spouse or form an alliance with their other parent, in the case of alienation, who they couldn't get enough from otherwise, or they're trying to not be triggered because their mental illness makes them feel like they're constantly on the verge of falling apart, or they don't know any other way to feel separate from you than to reject you. So they're trying to communicate something that's important to them. And the more that you can seek to understand, the better off you're going to be. The more you're going to move it towards reconciliation. Secondly, and more subtly, they're trying to sort out the past, and they can only do it by blaming you and kind of seeing what you do with it. If we get too reactive, too defensive, too angry, they don't really have an opportunity to actually see it. If we kind of go, well, maybe you're right there. Maybe you're onto something. I could see how you could have felt like that. They can relax. They can take a deep breath. They can lower their defenses. In reality, the more that we push back, the more that we defend, the more that we deny, the more that we get angry in response, the more they're just going to escalate their complaints, the more fantastic the complaints and the memories are going to be. I've seen in letters and correspondence from adult children that sometimes they start out quite reasonably, but the more the parent denies, the more agitated the adult child comes, and the more harsh the complaints about the parent becomes. The more that we can meet them where they are, find some kind of common ground, the more they're going to be able to relax and see you with some degree of objectivity. Now, parents often ask me, well, do they even have access to their good feelings or memories about me? And what I commonly think is, well, probably not when they're in the midst of an alienation or estrangement. But if you can be engaged with them in a way that doesn't cause them to feel defensive or criticized or shamed or pushed away or made to feel guilty or stupid, then they're far more likely to lower the defenses that are keeping them from seeing you in a good way or seeing all the good, loving things that you did for them as a parent or as a person. So another reason that adult children say really critical, hurtful, cruel things is that they're just trying to separate, and they don't know any other way to feel separate from you than to put a wedge between you and them. And it's sort of a way of having a boundary. If they were healthier and better off, they'd be able to say what, a handful of adult children can say, which is, look, I just need more time. It isn't your fault. I just need some time to be on my own. You didn't do anything wrong. I'll be back in touch when I'm able to. Some are able to do some version of that. Most can't. Most have to blame the parent in the same way that when people get divorced, they may just feel like the marriage has outlived its usefulness and they'd just be better off separating. Instead, they have to say how terrible the other person was and how neglectful they were and blah, blah, blah. Well, the same is true if an adult child needs, for whatever reason, to feel separate from the parent. And again, sometimes we've given our kids too much. And I don't mean materially, we've just given them too much love or tenderness or attention. And they're like, enough already. I need to sort of figure out who I am on my own without your help. And that's why I've heard more than once this idea that I don't know any other way to get my parents' voice out of my head than to separate, than to just be completely estranged. Okay, moving on. Mistake number 4. Okay. Mistake number 4, if you haven't already figured out, is returning fire with fire. So, I hope I've made it clear that I totally get how any parent who's going through estrangement or alienation has a right to be furious. When you're going through it, you feel devalued, misunderstood, shamed, humiliated, rejected, kicked to the curb, your child has taken the most vulnerable, tender part of you and rubbed your nose in it. You feel blamed for things that you never did or said, or if you did say or do them, should be fairly balanced out by all the loving, dedicated things that you did as a parent over your many years of parenting. So a lot of parents wonder, should I even keep trying? And as I've said, a lot of these kids are frankly abusive. They're abusive in their blame, in their coldness, in their lack of empathy, in their contempt. And of course, that can create enormous pain in the parent. And pain often leads to anger, or anger can lead to rage. But if your goal is reconciliation, then you're not doing yourself any favors by getting mad at your adult child. Now, this is often where friends or therapists of the estranged parent make a mistake, and that is encouraging them to be more assertive. I mean, there's a way to be assertive that keeps the conversation going, but that's if it's done very calmly and lovingly. But a lot of parents feel like, well, I'm just not going to take that crap, and they can't push me around, and they can't treat me like that. But if you have that attitude where you're just going to kind of, treat fire with fire, your child is just going to escalate. First of all, they probably don't have any idea that they're making you feel as horribly as they're making you feel. So you're just going to stir yourself up, and you're not going to respond well. And all the research says that the more stirred up we are, the less we're able to even think clearly. So you're better off working on soothing yourself if you're going to have an interaction with your child that's coming up. So you might want to write out everything that you want to say if you're going to have an interaction with them. That's why, or even write them if you think that you're not going to be able to respond in a good way. If your child does do or say something that makes you furious, try to get out of the interaction as quickly as you can. If you feel your temperature rising, you might say something like, well, I suspect this isn't going to be very productive. Maybe I should go. If you want, we can talk about this later, but make sure that you're sort of exiting the interaction before you get too angry or upset. Now, I know a lot of you have no contact whatsoever and would probably be glad to even have angry contact from your child. But so I highlight these mistakes and how to respond to them, because a lot of times when parents start to do the techniques that I recommend, their child does come back in contact, but sometimes they come back in contact with guns blazing. They come back in contact with a letter that says, I'm willing to reopen contact, but first you have to do, this legal pad full of requirements. And often that can kind of put things on the wrong foot. So you want to have these things really in mind, so that when your child does come back into contact with you, you're able to respond in a productive way. And other ways you can respond are just say you need to take a time out, try to actively slow down your breathing, count to 10 before you respond, don't reinitiate contact until you're calm. Use I statements. I statements, for example, are, when you call me names, I feel really misunderstood, rather than you're such a selfish little brat. How can you treat me like that? Or to try to speak to what you think the child's motivation is. You might say something like, well, I think you're really trying to get me to see something that you think is really important for me to understand. And maybe you feel like you have to hit me over the head with it in order for me to get it. And maybe, in the past, I've given you cause to feel like that. I don't know. But it's actually very hard for me to concentrate on what you're saying when you yell at me or you're calling me names. So do you think that you could just try telling me in a calm way? I promise to listen and to respond better than I did in the past. So those are some techniques if you find yourself getting too angry. But just remember that not only is guilt not your friend, returning fire with fire is also not your friend. There's no upside to it. Yeah, you're going to feel better for like a minute after you get it off your chest and finally tell your kid off or their spouse off about how terribly they've treated you and how unfair it all is, but it is only going to push your child away. Back to mistake number one. Is that fair? No, it's not fair at all. If your kid's being hostile towards you, it's human nature to be hostile back. I have a little bit of a temper myself. So, for me, when my kids have been mad at me, I've gotten mad back. And I'm sure part of my estrangement was in part a result of that. So over time, I've learned to become much more mellow. I'm in California. It's easy to learn how to be mellow in California, but I've learned how to respond not out of my anger and to self-soothe so that I don't respond out of anger. And it just works so much better. Okay, moving right along. Mistake number 5, failing to see how long reconciliation takes or not seeing the progress that is occurring. In general, reconciliation is typically a marathon. It's not a sprint. Sometimes parents start to do the strategies that I recommend, and the child responds right away, like to an amends letter, and say things like, wow, that's the letter that I always hoped that you would send me. I feel finally understood and heard. Yes, let's meet. Yes, let's talk. I do see that sometimes, but I don't always. Sometimes the child totally ignores the parent, or they pick apart the amends letter, or they don't say anything to it, but maybe a few months later, they'll start responding. But either way, it's typically a marathon and not a sprint. So I don't want anybody to have the idea that if you do make a few good steps, then, the Red Sea is going to part. It might, but it's just as likely that it might not. So sometimes there are little glimmers of light along the way, little crumbs. And as one estranged mother said to me, well, I don't want to take, these crumbs and try to make a 3-layer cake out of them. And I understand that feeling, that it's hard to feel very excited if you get one text, a year, or you get a happy Mother's Day or Father's Day card, and then your kid goes back to being underground for another 6 to 8 months or whatever. It's hard to see those as little glimmers of light or hope, but I think it's useful for you to be able to see them as little glimmers of light or hope. And that your child, if they haven't blocked you or sent out a restraining order, particularly if they'll occasionally take a phone call or their spouse will, that over time, that could be something that you can build into something more meaningful. Now, that doesn't mean if you're not getting any of those, as I know is true often, that all is lost. It just means that if you're getting those little things, those are little kind of lights in the sand that you can use to keep going in that direction. Now, a question that I often get from parents, and this is kind of related to mistake number 4, returning fire with fire, is when do I get to say how I feel? When do I, the answer is, well, you can say it whenever you want to say it, but what's your goal? If your goal is reconciliation, saying how you feel probably isn't going to buy very much interest or move towards reconciliation from your child. I get how any parent would want to say it. I have supported parents who've given up on their adult child because they just do feel too fed up, too sick of being mistreated, too sick of being treated like a pedophile around their grandparents, the grandchildren, despite the fact that they were very loving, tender, involved grandparents. So I totally understand and can support a parent who goes, you know what, enough is enough. I'm not going to keep trying. But, if you make that decision, I recommend that you just let the line go cold and don't tell your child that you're going to do it. Why? Because I think you want it to invite more self-reflection, meaning I think you want them to be able to be curious about why you're suddenly not in contact, or why you've let the line, why you've gone no contact. You want them to be able to say, it's been 8 months. Usually I hear from my mother or father more often than that. Or it's been a year. Oh, that's right. I've told them I wanted to go no contact. Well, do I really want to go no contact? Let me think about it. Whereas if we're kind of constantly circling, above them with the occasional gifts or, texts or whatever, they may never have enough time to kind of calm themselves down. So that's why for some parents, particularly those who've gotten restraining orders sent or threats of getting attorneys or the police, or they just get completely, enraged every time the parent reaches out to them, I typically recommend that those parents let the line go cold for at least a year. And sometimes that can work for the following reasons. One is that it may cause the adult child to feel like the parent is actually respecting their wishes, to not be in contact, and that may allow them to get something that they rightly or wrongly feel like they need. So it may cause them to respect the parent more because the parent isn't continuing to just throw good energy after bad. That old saying, how can I miss you if you never go away, is also true in family relationships. So if the parent stops being in contact and lets the line go cold, then the child may actually miss the parent, may invite more self-reflection and cause them to think more about the parent more than they might otherwise. So if we're constantly circling above them with, in the many ways that we can, they may be constantly triggered and made defensive by that. So in some ways, you're giving them a gift by just going completely out of contact if it's been a while. Now, I don't recommend parents do that with minors, but with adult children, I do recommend that. Okay, mistake number 6, assuming that their distance or negativity is all about you. The reality is that, by the time we have adult children or grandchildren, our children and grandchildren really become, in many ways, the center of our lives. We may have good marriages and friendships and careers and interests, et cetera. But in terms of what we're most likely to be preoccupied by, it's probably our adult children and our grandchildren. If it's going well, the joys and pleasures. If it's going terribly, the heartache and pain and sorrow of it. But we're very preoccupied with them. They're not very preoccupied with us. I mean, I was fortunate enough to have good, loving parents, but I always knew when I called them or visited them that it was far more meaningful to them than it was to me. For them, it was like the highlight of their days, not because I'm so amazing, but just I think that's the way parents feel. Whereas for the adult child, there's a certain amount of checking a box, even if they're fond of their parents. Our adult children are far more preoccupied with their own marriages or their divorces or their own children or building their careers or developing them or their own social lives. As parents, frankly, we're pretty far down the list. So what can happen, though, is we start complaining about it and particularly feeling like our children owe us more and should be more available and much more responsive to us. That's when we make them feel guilty. And now we are into a fight with them. And now you are going to get much more complaints about you than you might not have gotten otherwise. So it's so easy when we're going through an estrangement or an alienation to assume that everything, all the distance or the non-responsiveness is about us, or it comes from an angry or rejecting place in them. But it may have little to nothing to do with that. It may be much more a function of their preoccupation with their own lives and that kind of thing. Okay, so in the remaining 5 minutes or so here, I want to talk a little bit about the let's say that your child does reconcile with you for a variety of reasons. Well, one of the things that parents often say or feel in early reconciliation is that they feel like they're walking on eggshells. So, and it feels really phony to them or awkward or, difficult to maintain. And what I constantly tell parents is, well, yeah, you should be walking on eggshells. You know why? Because any kid who would do that to a parent once is perfectly capable of doing that to them again. And it's not super uncommon that if a kid does go no contact with a parent once, that they do it again for a variety of different reasons. So if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, that's because your kid is perfectly capable of doing it again. Some kids, no matter what their complaints were about their parent, would never estrange their parents. Most of us would never have estranged our parents, no matter how badly we were treated. Whereas this, generation of adult children has been given that kind of key to the kingdom of estrangement. So those who can do it once could easily do it again. So if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, that's because some part of your mind is telling you that it would be foolish not to. It would be foolish to act like, okay, everything's back to normal. I can call you as much as I want. I don't have to be that careful about whatever is going to trigger you or upset you or et cetera, crossing your boundaries or gaslight you, whatever it is. I can just be myself. Well, guess what? No, you can't. Because if your kid did it once, they could do it again. The causes of estrangement aren't typically completely resolved. They could get re-triggered. And also your feelings of hurt or anger about the estrangement may push your child away. So how do you stop walking on eggshells? Well, the first way to do it is just to acknowledge that it's reasonable that you feel that way. Don't shame yourself for it. Don't worry about it. Your kid has just put you through a major trauma. Of course, you're walking on eggshells and you're afraid of your child, but you have to turn toward it rather than turn away from it. This goes to the notion of radical acceptance that I was talking about earlier. You need to expect that it's going to be awkward for a while. There's just no way that a parent and adult child can come back together after a period of estrangement and have everything be normal. Now, your kid may act normal, kind of like, hey, how you been? It's great to see you again. What you been up to? And you want to say, oh, what I've been up to is like being devastated over the fact that you haven't been talking to me for the past few years. But yeah, no, I'm fine. Thanks. And you? I mean, it's a hard position for parents to be in. In general, though, my advice is to take them where they are. If they want to be upbeat, act like things are fine, this didn't happen or whatever, take them where they are. But they may want to talk about it. They may want to have a bunch of rules of re-engagement, which a lot of them do, as I was saying earlier. So you want to do that, meet them there as well and be open to having that discussion. If they're cautious in checking you out, then you should be somewhat cautious yourself. Don't get too far ahead of them in your mood or what you talk about. But in general, this goes to not making them feel guilty. You also don't want to act too wounded or angry about them, because that can also cause them to pull away and withdraw from you. Another thing that can be useful to do is to ask for guidance, whether you do or don't understand what happened. It may be useful, not necessarily in the first session or two, but to say something like, look, I'm very happy that we've been able to spend time together again, since I clearly did some things in the past that were upsetting to you. I'm wondering if we could make the agreement going forward that we'll try to stay current on things that are bugging either one of us, that build up. Now, here I say either one of us, but it's really going to be whether anything that you do bugs them. The main point is that you're encouraging them to tell you what's bothering them, and that alone will gain you credibility and increase the chances of their communicating with you. But a lot of these kids actually don't understand why they cut off the parent, or they're worried about re-triggering your feelings, or they feel guilty about it. So they don't necessarily want to have the conversation. And that's why I often encourage parents to just take the child where they are and not get too far ahead of them. Okay, finally, parents often want to know, well, how often do I have to keep apologizing for whatever mistakes that I made? And, what I say is write one really good amends letter according to the guidelines that I laid out in my webinars, which you can find on my website or email me, or maybe I've even given something like that here or will in the future if Elaine has her way. But you write one really good amends letter. And then if you get no response 6 to 8 weeks later, you write a follow-up that just says, Hi, checking in, just wanting to see if you had a chance to review the letter that I sent to you. I'm sure there were things that I left out that would have been good to have included, but I wanted to see if there was a way to get a conversation started. I hope you'll let me know if there are things that you'd like me to work on, or if you're open to doing family therapy, I would welcome that as well. Love mom, love dad, boom, you're done. You don't feel like you have to do anything more. You don't have to keep apologizing. You did it. Now it's really in your kids' camp. If they want to be a stand-up person and accept the olive branch, then great. If they don't, then you have to stop trying and obsessing about them. You have to turn your attention and your love and your care towards yourself. And again, you have to own the narrative of what kind of a parent and person you were, and remember all the good things about you and the way that you are a good person and a good parent. And I will see you here in future webinars. Thank you for showing up.